You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Hello and welcome to IDS 318, Cultural Pluralism, Immigration in the United States. My name is Mike Fraga and I'm your host and guide to a course that seeks to understand some of the issues that concern the contemporary United States immigrant population. The historical experiences of the diverse immigrant populations that created and continue to create the economic and social foundation of the United States will be surveyed along with the legal steps that an immigrant must follow in order to achieve citizenship. This course will be done in an effort to bring awareness to the contemporary human crisis. So the course explores immigration policy and its effects on the Chicano, Mexicana, Latino communities in specific, but really United States society as a whole. Now, the purpose of the course is to learn about the dilemma of U.S. immigration, its history, policy, and the current crisis. Now, despite the fact that the United States claims to be a nation of immigrants, when we talk about the immigration process, it has evoked a wide range of responses from various sectors of the U.S. population. And these responses include fear, anxiety, sympathy, hate, ethnocentrism, misunderstanding, racial profiling, scapegoating, and xenophobia. Yet immigrants continue to come to the United States in search of work, family unification, better opportunities, asylum, and refuge. So when we take a look at the world's nations, they have their populations existing as American citizens in the United States today. And their respective histories intermingle in the streets of all the major cities of the United States. And in this course, we are exploring the different racial and continental expressions emanating from the American immigrant experience. There are all of the peoples of the world. And what's so funny is that all of these peoples of the world are right here living in Los Angeles, in this place called Los Angeles. So everywhere you look, one sees Europeans, Africans, Asians, Southeast Asians, known as Indians, Pacific Islanders, Middle Easterners, Latin Americans, Mexicans, and most importantly, native peoples from throughout the Western Hemisphere. We are all part of a place that's known as Nuestra Señora cerca del Río Porciúncula, Reina Los Angeles. Now, for those of you who are out there in cable land, there is an 800 number that is available for you. And by all means, please call in if you have any questions or comments about the topics that will be covered today. Students, likewise, call in. Let me hear your voices. Let me know who you are, and let me know about your ideas, what you like and not like about this particular class, what you're learning. Share with me your experiences. And students also, please take advantage of the online address and chat with me as we explore some concepts for the course. So for right now, let's try to understand what's happening today, and then we'll kind of come back and appreciate the foundation for today. So let's go to a film clip that helps us understand what's happening today with regards to immigration.
From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Was Sheriff Joe convicted for doing his job? That's what... He should have had a jury, but you know what? I'll make a prediction. I think he's going to be just fine, okay?
In a campaign-style rally in Phoenix, Arizona, President Trump hints he'll soon pardon Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who was convicted in a racial profiling case. While thousands protested outside, Trump railed against his critics and the corporate media while defending his response to the deadly white supremacist rally in Charlottesville. We'll go to Phoenix to get response. Then we go behind the scenes with Alec Baldwin, the man who impersonates Trump on Saturday Night Live.
So I'll sit in the room and try to, my neck gets sore. I'll sit in the room for like 30 minutes before we go on there, and I'll sit there, I'll be going, it's fantastic. It's fantastic. You know, like really trying to get my mouth in that zone where you push your face out like you're in the movie Alien.
We'll talk to Alec Baldwin about Trump, the media, and why, well, Alec Baldwin may run for office someday. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Phoenix, Arizona, thousands of people poured into the streets outside the Phoenix Convention Center on Tuesday night to protest President Trump's campaign rally. During his speech, Trump defended his response to the deadly white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. He also spent at least 20 minutes attacking the corporate media and its coverage of his response to last weekend's events in Charlottesville. Trump read from a printout of remarks he made on 3 separate occasions, yet omitted that he blamed both sides for the violence. Trump did not pardon notorious Arizona Sheriff Joe Arpaio Tuesday, as many had expected, but during his speech, he did speak highly of the sheriff who's been convicted of contempt of court for defying a court order to stop his deputies from racial profiling.
By the way, I'm just curious. Do the people in this room like Sheriff Joe? So, was Sheriff Joe convicted for doing his job? That's what... He should have had a jury, but you know what? I'll make a prediction. I think he's going to be just fine, okay? But I won't do it tonight because I don't want to cause any controversy. Is that okay? All right?
That's Donald Trump hinting he might be pardoning Sheriff Arpaio, a major supporter of Donald Trump whose policies have included racial profiling and detaining immigrants in a scorching outdoor tent city jail, which Arpaio once referred to as his own concentration camp. During Trump's speech, police attacked the thousands of protesters with tear gas and pepper balls. There are also some reports the police fired rubber-coated steel bullets at the protesters. We'll go to Phoenix after headlines for more on the protests and Trump's speech. Meanwhile, in a victory for educators and ethnic studies advocates, a federal judge has ruled the state of Arizona violated students' First and 14th Amendment rights by eliminating a Mexican-American studies program from Tucson public schools. In 2010, Arizona passed a controversial law banning the teaching of any class designed for a particular ethnic group that would, quote, promote resentment toward a race or class of people, unquote. The law ended up eliminating Tucson's ethnic studies program and banning 7 books from public schools, including Rethinking Columbus, The Next 500 Years, Shakespeare's play The Tempest, Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, and Chicano, The History of the Mexican-American Civil Rights Movement. A slew of right-wing and white supremacist rallies have been canceled across the country following the massive nationwide protests against white supremacy. On Saturday, up to 40,000 people poured into the streets around the Boston Common to protest a planned rally by white nationalists. The flood of counter-protests so overwhelmed the white nationalist rally that aerial photos show only a handful of extremists even showed up, and that they spent the day huddled in a gazebo on the Boston Common. Thousands more rallied over the weekend against white supremacy in dozens of other U.S. cities. In response, far-right and white nationalist groups have canceled 67 upcoming rallies, saying the protests will instead be held online. Meanwhile,
Okay, so students and audience out there in cable land, how do we come to this? When did all of this begin, and how did we get here? Well, that's what we're going to try to address today. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at U.S. immigration policy to 1924. And the reason why I select 1924, and that year was one of the most racist Congresses is going to pass a piece of legislation known as the Immigration Quota Act of 1924, and it's going to stay in the books until the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s finally will encourage a more liberal Congress to abolish it. But we're going to take a look at today's session. We're going to cover the history of immigration policy on the North American continent since the arrival of Columbus. And we're going to explore the history of U.S. immigration policy to 1924. So, emphasis is going to be placed on immigration policy and its direct relationship to the formation and control of labor forces. So I shared with you last week, a key concept here is the formation and control of labor forces. So when we take a look at immigration policy, and we look at its foundation, that's what we're going to understand all the way to 1924, we're going to try to appreciate how immigration policy was created, first by England, and then it was adopted by the United States. And basically, when we take a look at immigration policy is related to foreign policy. Okay? So, those of you out in cable land and those students who are online, please share with me any personal stories you might have about the immigrant experience and its relationship to foreign policy. So the focus today is on the history of immigration to this country and the creation of policy surrounding the movement of populations. So students, again, understand formation and control of labor forces as related to immigration policy. The focus is going to be policies designed to form labor forces, policies designed to control labor forces from the colonial period through the early years of U.S. national formation, and then appreciating what will be known as the first and the second great waves of immigration in the 19th century, and then we will conclude with the period immediately after World War I. It was an era that witnessed massive restrictive legislation in the 1920s. So what I want to do today is provide a general overview of the policies pursued by the colonial governments, in this particular case, Britain, Great Britain, or England, and then the United States, and we'll end with 1924. So when we appreciate that once Columbus initiated the encounter between what is referred to as the Old World and the New World, European powers, specifically Spain, France, and England, and then the United States, are going to negotiate agreements for the recruitment of labor forces. And the idea is to expand markets. In the process, international accords are going to be written specifically connecting the movement of populations to the expansion of markets. This is so important. Spain, France, England actively recruited populations for the expansion of their colonial markets. That's why they call them colonies. That's why it's known as the colonial era. Their foreign policies incorporated legal instruments to contract and form labor forces. They searched for labor forces. They created labor contracting agencies throughout Europe. Then they went to Africa, and then they went to Asia. And these labor forces from Europe, Africa, and Asia are going to find their way to the Western Hemisphere. And that's why we have from Canada all the way down to Argentina. Africans, Asians, Europeans are going to come to the Western Hemisphere. So when the United States was created, the Founding Fathers inherited the British colonial experience that shaped the way the Constitution is going to approach immigration and, most importantly, settlement policy. So immigration, please understand, has been tied to labor force recruitment. Immigration has always been tied to labor force participation. So foreign policy, very important. That is the instrument to secure that is used to secure workers for the expansion of markets. So let's address what is known as pre-revolutionary immigration. All right. Now, prior to the creation of the United States, immigration was so common that colonial governments, the British, the French, the Spanish, they didn't regulate the flow of populations. For nearly 2 centuries, immigrants were desired. And adventurers were recruited through legal means, through extra-legal means, to expand the influence of the Spanish, French, and British interests in the Western Hemisphere. The arrivals of the earliest European and African immigrants are relatively well documented. And the historical record notes that the arrival of the Spanish missionaries at St. Augustine in 1565, and the Spanish settlement of New Mexico, a colony in New Mexico in 1598, precedes the foundation of Jamestown in 1607. So, and plus the arrival of the first African in Virginia is going to be in 1619. So when we take a look at the arrival of the Pilgrims in Massachusetts in 1620, of which we're going to be celebrating in regards to Thanksgiving soon, that's always celebrated as the national symbol of the founding of the United States. But in reality, the Pilgrims in Massachusetts, they were really late in the period of initial European colonization of territory that later became the United States. In fact, as we will know later on when we talk about the brown beans, that Spanish is going to be the first language that's going to be spoken, first European language that's going to be spoken in the United States prior to English. But by the 1630s, however, immigration to what was to become the United States was so common that individual arrivals and even the total number of immigrants went unrecorded. And this was so for nearly 2 centuries, during which immigration to the colonies and then to the new United States was largely unregulated, especially by England, France, and Spain. Immigration during this first phase, which was known as pre-revolutionary immigration, differs somewhat from the periods that followed, but yet patterns are going to be developed that are going to repeat themselves throughout U.S. history. And again, when we take a look at what we just viewed with regards to Trump and what is happening in Arizona with Sheriff Joe Arpaio, and especially with regards to Mexican Mexican studies, Mexican-American studies in Tucson, and the court overturning the decision to abolish that, how we got to that, let's understand what is important to note, especially as it pertains to the Latin American immigrant experience. These are the underlying attitudes that were formed and shaped since the colonial period. So when we talk about racism, the United States and Europe has a strong history of racism in the Western Hemisphere. This is not something new. Native peoples, people of color understand this very clearly. Racism, U.S. has a long history of it. But nonetheless, the underlying attitudes for this come from the colonial period, especially the attitudes towards race. So colonialism and the attitude towards race that developed over time are very important for us in our discourse over immigration policy today. This is not something new. Trump is not spinning out something that's new. This has been a long process. So if you could put it down to the bottom thirds, colonialism and the attitudes towards race, this is very central. Despite the fact that the United States is and always has been a nation of immigrants, the immigration process evokes a wide range of responses from various sectors of the U.S. population. And as I shared with you earlier, there's fear, anxiety, sympathy, hate, ethnocentrism, misunderstanding, racial profiling, scapegoating, xenophobia. So all of these anxieties, we can trace them back to the Spanish, the British, and the French, and the colonial heritage that they left us. Their respective attitudes towards race is most important. Now, the textbook that you are reading, Juan Gonzalez, Harvest of Empire, does a very good job, students, in tracing what kind of people were the original English and Spanish immigrant settlers. And in chapter 1, he looks at how their views and customs that they brought with them affected the America they fashioned. He directly deals with the question, what was the legacy of these immigrant settlers' religious beliefs, their racial policies, and their economic relationships? So, if we can appreciate the rendition by Gonzalez, then we can understand and appreciate the underlying racial bigotry and xenophobia, which always rears itself in the historical debate over immigration reform. And right now, Trump is doing that most effectively. The role of race in Spain and England is important to appreciate. Beyond their religious practices, the English and the Spanish colonial worlds diverged substantially in their attitudes towards native peoples, in their attitudes towards Africans, in their attitudes towards Asians, in their attitudes towards slavery, in their attitudes towards race. Now, Gonzalez, students, relates how the Spanish had a tradition of racial mixing, and so supposedly it made it more acceptable for Spanish settlers to engage in sexual unions with both native peoples and Africans. Hence, that's why you have all the mixed bloods in Latin America. Meanwhile, in the Anglo-Saxon colonies, for the British, interracial mixing was taboo by any class of whites. Race mixing was banned in Great Britain or in the British colonies, and then when the United States was created, race mixing was banned until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Again, that's the difference between the Spanish and the British. But Gonzalez emphasizes certain things that I will challenge later on when I get to the brown beans. Gonzalez emphasizes that while rape or unsanctioned unions obviously occurred, Anglo-Saxons almost never recognized their mixed-race children, no matter how light-skinned the offspring or how poor the father. And he kind of shares with you that perhaps in Latin America, racism was less oppressive as it was in Great Britain or in the English colonies and in the United States. But I'm going to disagree with that, as when I get to the brown beans, I'm going to share with you, students, how racism was even more sophisticated in Latin America. The United States just came out and said, Africans, blacks, Mexicans, Asians, out of the way. That's fine. But in Latin America, it was very sophisticated, because Latin America has a very sophisticated racialized system. But nonetheless, let's go to the English. Let's take a look at the English in the 17th century. And as we explore in later presentation on the Spanish conquest of the Western Hemisphere, while Spanish explorers are going to be claiming lands for the crown, and the Spanish church is going to be busy transforming native peoples into Spanish-speaking workers, remember, the Spanish were here at least 100 to 120 years before the British. But meanwhile, the British colonies, by contrast, are going to be a combination of economic experiments in Virginia and family settlements in Massachusetts. Now, the English rarely incorporated native peoples in their societies. The English rarely made unions between natives and whites. In fact, those unions were looked down upon. Now, most often, the English segregated themselves from the native peoples. And New England Puritans did not even venture out of their settlements to win converts like the Spanish. English kings, under the influence of Protestantism, ordered their colonists to conquer, occupy, and possess the lands of the heathens and infidels, as they described them. And under Elizabeth I, the English confronted the Spanish on a number of fronts, leading to a showdown in 1588. In fact, it is this showdown that's going to allow England to finally come to the Western Hemisphere and search for settlements. Elizabeth identified Spain as a threat to their national church, now Protestant, and to their independence as a nation. So when we take a look at the 16th century, it was about plunder and exploration. But the 17th century witnessed the creation of colonies for the explicit expansion of European markets. So when we take a look at England between 1630 to 1700, approximately 600,000 immigrants are going to arrive here in North America in the 17th century. Approximately 155,000 English immigrants settled in the British colonies. Now, these English immigrants accounted for approximately 90% of European immigrants to the colonies. The next largest group was African, and they arrived not as voluntary immigrants, but as involuntary immigrants. And by being involuntary, their forced migration reduced the demand for labor of voluntary migrants from Europe. Now, what do I mean by involuntary immigrants? Well, I'm going to talk about labor recruitment. All of this gets us to the notion of forming and controlling labor forces for the expansion of colonial markets. This is so crucial in appreciating immigration. Labor recruitment is the key to migration of populations since the colonial period. Why is there an immigration policy? Because systems need workers. Now, the major distinction among European immigrants to the British colonies before the American Revolution related to the way in which they were able to afford passage to the colonies. Some were able to immigrate based on their own or their family resources. Generally, they had skills, or they had capital, or they worked in a specific profession as they occupied positions in an expanding colonial market. They were government officials, they were clergy, they were merchants, they were artisans, they were gentry, they were of the lesser nobility. But the majority, the mass of immigrants, came as indentured servants or as slaves. Now, the indentured servants were required, let me just share with you the difference between indentured servants versus slavery. Indentures were required to perform, on average, 8 years of labor to repay the price of their passage. Because of a lack of capital and skills, they were forced to perform arduous labor. And many times, because of a lack of opportunity, their indentured status was extended. So for indentured servants, their only opportunity for success was the British elimination policy of native peoples from their land. Or if they wanted, they could run away from their oppressive master, and many times as they ran away, they went and joined native peoples' resistance movements. Let's go to a film clip that emphasizes the importance of indentured servitude to the creation of the United States. Author and worker cooperative member John Curl discusses the Mayflower Compact, indentured servants, and the English corporate investment in the colonial ventures. Now, his book, entitled For All the People, Uncovering the Hidden History of Cooperation, Cooperative Movements, and Communalism in America, is very important because it shares a very rich foundation of community in the British experience that is not often emphasized, especially in this capitalist world, because there is a communitarian, a communalist, a communist tradition. Let's take a look at the indentured servants.
This is the story of the Mayflower, actually, of the Pilgrim voyage. On 3 days before they, or 2 or 3 days before they landed, the majority of the people there, over 50%, were indentured servants. And they staged a revolt on board. And what came out of it is the famous document known as the Mayflower Compact, where all the people there were declared themselves equal, free and equal. They revolted against the form of servitude that most of them had been committed, had signed up to put themselves under. And through a revolt of revolutionary servants, the first New England colony, Plymouth, became a democracy of sorts. It was a limited democracy, but it was the most democratic society at that time in colonial America. Well, in the colonies, the most of the colonies, or all of the British colonies, were really set up by corporations. And as soon as possible, people who were hooked into it, who were often indentured servants, where they signed up for passage for a certain number of years, they would have to work off the money that the passage cost, and then they were able to get off on their own. And they, as soon as they got out, and many of them just ran away from that form of bondage, and went off into the wilderness. So, but as soon as they got into their own communities, into small towns, small villages, they were basically cooperative communities there. The cooperation was and democratic procedures were basically the way they they settled the country in the early years.
Okay, so indentured servitude, and it ties into the notion of involuntary immigrants. In this particular case, indentured servitude, they were voluntary immigrants. They signed a contract. They came to the United States. They came to what eventually will become the United States, and in their contract, they were required to work a number of years because they lacked capital. They lacked perhaps skills. And they were forced to perform arduous labor, and many times because of their lack of opportunity, their indentured status was extended. Now, most often, when these indentured servants rebelled, especially in the southern colonies, it paved the way for their replacement as workers through the introduction of slavery. So, indentured servitude has always been tied with African slavery. Masters do not like it, white masters do not like it when white workers rebel. Please understand that. Wherever slavery appeared in the British colonial empire, historians have documented that it was usually preceded by white indentured servitude. So wherever slavery appears in the British colonies, it's usually because white indentured servitude led to rebellion. Many whites did not like the oppressive experience of indenturedness. So wherever slavery appeared, it was preceded by white indentured servitude. So very, very important. Eventually, the reliance on the African slave trade is going to influence historians to identify the expansion of markets as a triangular trade. Now let's go to a film clip that helps us appreciate the importance of the involuntary immigrants that are going to arrive in this country.
Historians estimate that between 1500 and 1870, more than 11 million men and women were carried across the Atlantic Ocean in ships like these. The passengers were forcibly transported from Africa to the West Indies, Brazil, or other lands of the Americas. These people were enslaved Africans, and their lives on board the slave ships were filled with pain, suffering, and death. In the 1500s, Europeans saw enslaved Africans as a source of inexpensive labor for their colonies. European planters established plantations or huge farms in North America, South America, and the Caribbean. As the plantations grew, more slaves were needed to work on them. Slavery had existed in Africa since ancient times. Some African kings and merchants captured people and sold them as slaves to European traders, as well as to Arab merchants. When the demand grew, kings often sent their warriors to attack neighboring villages for slaves. The Europeans treated slaves like cargo. They were locked inside cells for weeks until ships could take them to colonies across the ocean. For slaves, life on a slave ship during the Middle Passage was a nightmare. Even crew members were shocked by the conditions in the slave holds.
When I had to enter the slave deck, I was forced to crawl over the slaves. The Negroes are frequently packed so close together that they have not so much room as a man in his coffin. I was so overcome with the heat, stench, and foul air that I nearly fainted. It was only with assistance I could get on deck.
Alexander Falconbridge. Although the transatlantic slave trade, the bringing of slaves from Africa to the Americas, was abolished by U.S. law in 1804, some traders chose to ignore the law. They continued to capture Africans and transport them across the Atlantic.
Again, get to understand the notion of the formation and control of labor forces. And I had put up indentured servants versus African slavery, voluntary immigrants signing contracts, involuntary immigrants forced into labor. But the whole idea is labor force recruitment for the expansion of markets. Okay? Now, most often, like I shared with you, what is important for us to appreciate in this class, especially as it pertains to the Latin American immigrant experience, and as you will become familiar with the Gonzalez textbook. Those are the underlying attitudes from the colonial experience towards race. Now, colonialism and the attitude towards race that developed over time become important for us in our discourse over immigration reform today. Just take a look. We started out with appreciating Trump and how he went to Arizona and he liberated Joe Arpaio from his racist policy of just indiscriminately incarcerating. I mean, if you looked Mexican, you were undocumented, you were incarcerated until you could prove that you were here, that you were born here. The others, of course, in Joe Arpaio was supposed to serve time in prison as a result of his policy, and Trump pardoned him. And then, of course, there was the policy in Arizona to ban Chicano studies in Tucson, in the Tucson School District, that a judge likewise overthrew because of his racist policy. But Trump went into Arizona to go ahead and expand on this racism. So let's appreciate this experience. It goes back to the colonial period, as we will come to appreciate in future presentations. The Spanish attempted to incorporate native labor forces by a process of interaction of the races known as mestizaje, or mixtures. That's why today you see all these wonderful black and brown expressions that make up the immigrant populations that arrive from Latin America today. And as I shared with you, there's the red beans, there's the white beans, there's the black beans, there's the yellow beans, and when you mix all of these together, you get down and you get the brown beans. Okay? So those are very important. All the brown beans from Latin America. They are part of the racial mixing that occurred since colonial times in the Caribbean, all the way and from Mexico down to Chile. But the British insistence on separation and removal led to a very racist characteristic that you can see spewing from the mouths of those who have a disdain for the immigrant today, and it goes all the way to the top. It goes all the way to this president. So let's go to a film clip from a PBS documentary entitled Africans in America, America's Journey Through Slavery. It chronicles indentured servitude in America, and it goes from white indentures to both white and black indentures. So let's appreciate that today's debate on the undocumented immigrant worker can be traced back to colonial times. Let's listen appreciatively to understand the current dilemma of the immigrants as they are treated as human cargo for the creation of wealth.
In 1619, a year before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, a mystery ship appeared out of a violent storm off the Virginia coast. No one recorded the ship's name, but somewhere on the high seas, she had robbed a Spanish vessel of a cargo of Africans. In search of supplies, she traded the Africans for food. They had been baptized and given Christian names. As Christians, they could not be enslaved for life under English law. Like most Europeans in the colony, they were purchased to work as servants for a limited number of years. The new arrival supplied much-needed labor for the tobacco crop that was making men rich. Settlers were planting tobacco in the streets of Jamestown, carving plantations out of the surrounding wilderness, and shipping some 60,000 pounds a year back to England.
Once tobacco is established as a viable commodity, then the more land you control, the bigger profits you can make. And in order to make those profits, you need more labor, and you look for that labor wherever you can find it.
Well, the colony builders initially intended to rely almost exclusively on white indentured servants as a labor force to cultivate the crops that were being grown in Virginia, principally tobacco. And in order to create these raw materials or goods, you often needed labor.
Here's a health to the company and one to my lass.
The world the Africans entered was controlled by wealthy Englishmen and populated by the English poor, most under the age of 25. In return for passage to Virginia, they had traded 4 to 7 years of their labor. They were bound to a master by an indenture form, a contract that defined length of service and the conditions of servitude. Most were promised freedom dues after their service, a bushel of corn, a new suit of clothes, and 100 acres of land. Under Virginia's head right system, a planter was entitled to 50 acres of land for each servant brought into the colony.
The issue always was how long that indenture would be and under what conditions you would be forced to work. At its best, it was a short, friendly apprenticeship. At its worst, it was a long and exploitative situation in which you might die before you ever obtained your freedom.
By 1622, 3,000 new settlers drawn by the opportunities of the tobacco boom had arrived in Virginia. 2 years later, the first Negro child was born in the colony. He was named William Tucker, after a Virginia planter.
Okay, so when we get to the black bean experience, we will understand certain things with regards to the involuntary immigrant. But for right now, what we're attempting to do is appreciate the white and the black beans and the difference between indentured servitude and involuntary immigration. Voluntary immigration that came with a contract, indentured servitude, and then involuntary immigration, slavery. And as I shared with you, and what historians have noted, that most often African slavery replaced white indentured servitude when white indentured servants rebelled. When they rebelled, African slaves replaced them. So that is the 17th century. Let's go to the 18th century and let's understand that it's a different type of immigration that's coming into the United States. What would eventually become the United States and the 13 colonies, the British colonies. And that is known as, these immigrants are a little bit different. They're not primarily from Great Britain, but now they're German, Dutch, Scottish, and Irish. And these immigrants are going to be arriving in the 18th century. Spain, Britain, and France are going to be involved in a contest for control of the Caribbean, and they're going to be involved in a contest for control of the Mississippi River. Spain is in Florida. Great Britain has its 13 colonies from Georgia up to Massachusetts. And then there's the French that go down the Mississippi. So Spain, Britain, and France are going to be involved in a contest for control, not just of the Caribbean, which is providing valuable goods, raw materials, especially sugar and molasses, but also the Mississippi River. Immigration levels are going to increase vastly in the 18th century. The Europeans who immigrated to the British colonies were no longer primarily from the Anglo-Saxon areas. And these populations are going to be more diverse than the previous century. So whenever you go back to the 13 colonies, when you go back to the original 13 states, you will experience and appreciate this diversity. 40% of the immigrants that are going to be coming to Great Britain or the English colonies are Africans. They are destined for slavery. The voluntary immigrants included approximately 100,000 Irish. They were descendants of Scottish Presbyterians, and approximately 65,000 Germans, as well as Dutch and Scottish immigrants. So when you take a look at Pennsylvania, when you take a look at New Jersey, when you take and appreciate the histories of some of the southern colonies, the Carolinas, each of these groups are going to find homes in specific regions of the eastern seaboard, and they're initially going to try to create cultural links to the world that they left behind. They retain their native languages through the creation of linguistic schools, and they maintain their cultural customs through religion. So the immigrants who are going to create eventually the United States of America, they're going to benefit from the availability of land. And this is where the red beans comes in, the red beans, because one of the things that's going to happen when we talk about the red beans is that it's going to be their lands that the Europeans covet. And they're going to try to eliminate the red beans from their lands so as give opportunities to the white and blacks to come into work. And remember in that film clip, what it shared was that it was the white masters. There's always rich white males who are recruiting white workers to keep them in subservient positions. Please understand that. That's the nature of capital. Now, furthermore, the need for labor was prevalent throughout the era. Colonies actively recruited immigrants. The need for more workers was emphasized, especially when you take a look at the Declaration of Independence. Because in the Declaration of Independence, one of the things about the white owners is they didn't like the fact that Great Britain attempted to discourage immigration in the years leading up to the Revolution. So that is very important. You cannot stop the elite elements from recruiting workers. And Great Britain attempted to do that to prevent the elite elements from rebelling. Now, once the Revolutionary War was over, the number of immigrants are going to grow rapidly. So the Constitution didn't address the issue of immigration at the outset. Leaders of the Revolution, however, supported unlimited immigration of white Europeans, especially those who are wealthy or skilled. So, which gets us to the United States, and we'll understand certain things with regards to the colonial period, but let's get to the United States and immigration to once the United States was formed. Let's take a look at immigration to the United States between 1787 and 1840. When we take a look at the early 19th century immigration policy of the United States, it can be characterized as an open door for white Europeans with explicit instructions concerning the forced immigration of Africans to slavery. As we will witness in this class, there were few laws concerning immigration, and most that were enacted until the Civil War addressed really shipping and reporting requirements for the ships bringing immigrants to the United States. The American Revolution slowed immigration to the United States, and then the ultimate defeat of the British spurred an emigration or outmigration among British loyalists. But once the American Revolution ended, the Revolutionary War ended, immigration is going to resume, and the number of immigrants is rapidly going to grow. Now, although the Constitution itself does not address the issue of immigration, George Washington would not only welcomed not only the opulent and respected stranger in his work, but also the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions. Thomas Jefferson expressed some fears about the political assimilation of immigrants from nations ruled by absolute monarchs, but he also advocated government policies to attract immigrants who were wealthy or skilled. So when we take a look at most of the leaders of the new United States, they welcomed immigrants from Europe. Meanwhile, the Constitution was more explicit concerning the involuntary immigrant, concerning the forced migration of Africans. The framers of the Constitution prohibited Congress from restricting the importation of slaves prior to 1808. So the composition of post-revolutionary voluntary immigration was not significantly changed from the pre-revolutionary period. British and Scottish immigrants dominated the flow in these decades. But most of these immigrants settled in the cities of what would become the Northeast of the United States. Like their predecessors, these immigrants experienced considerable economic opportunity. Immigrants of this era had the option of migration westward as native peoples were constantly being removed towards the west. This geographic mobility reduced the potential for the formation of cohesive ethnic communities, and it also reduced the likelihood of anti-immigrant movements by the U.S. born in the cities and regions where the immigrants first settled. So during the first decade of this country's history, the elite consensus supporting unfettered European immigration is going to give way to a period of anti-immigrant fervor that reached its peak with the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. Now, Nia, there's a student who has a question. Nia, thank you for participating in the class. Appreciate it. You're having a question. It says, Gonzalez points out that NAFTA was supposed to lessen the financial need for Mexicans to emigrate. Why did it ultimately have the opposite effect? Nia, your question is a little bit off target with regards to what it is that I'm presenting right now. I understand you've perhaps read the introduction to Gonzalez's book, and that is very important. Ultimately, when we take a look at that experience, I'll be addressing it when we deal with the 20th century. So if you can just hold your question. And ultimately, let me just very quickly, what happened to the North American Free Trade Agreement is that it allowed American corporations to dump their excess corn and beans onto the Mexican market, which eventually abolished the opportunities of Mexican small farmers to sell their beans and corn on the market. And so a lot of people lost their livelihood. And that's ultimately the opposite effect. And so NAFTA encouraged many people who are being displaced to come to the United States to find where the jobs were. But very quickly, Nia, thank you very much. Now, with regards to the first important act concerning immigrants during the first decade of the country's history came during a time of fear and reaction. And this is so important to appreciate about immigration policy and reform. It comes during a time of fear and reaction. So when we take a look at the first act concerning immigrants in this country, when this country was created, it introduced to us the concept of alien. And this is so important, alien. And most often, alien has always been associated with sedition. So let's appreciate alien and sedition. These are the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. Now, the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 were passed during a time of bitter partisan conflict between the Federalist Party of John Adams and the Democratic Republican Party of Thomas Jefferson. The origins of anti-immigrant fervor were both domestic and international. Now, domestically, immigrants were seen as a potential support for oppositional politics. Internationally, the cause was the French Revolution and the political turbulence that it spurred throughout Europe. Political refugees arrived en masse in the United States in the late 1790s. And many in the U.S. feared that the ideas of these political refugees would destabilize the new U.S. democracy. And this concern about immigrants translated into a political tone that questioned one's loyalty to the United States. Now, the administration of John Adams viewed immigrants as lending support to Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republican following. So let's hear from historian Eric Foner as he explains the atmosphere under which the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed.
Well, in 1798, the United States, under the presidency of John Adams, was involved in what was called the quasi-war with France. France and England were at war. The United States wasn't fully at war, but it was engaged in certain naval battles with France, and there was fear of a broader war. Congress, under the control of the Federalist Party, passed these Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Act basically gave the president the right to deport any immigrant he wanted, largely because the Federalist Party thought a lot of these immigrants coming in the 1790s were radical Jeffersonians who were voting for the Jeffersonian Republican Party. The Sedition Act basically made it a federal crime to criticize the government. As in other wars, the government doesn't like criticism, and it defines criticism of its policies as unpatriotic, as seditious, etc. So The Sedition Act made it possible for the federal government to prosecute and jail particularly newspaper editors who criticized the Adams administration. It was mostly a political measure. I mean, these newspapers weren't doing anything which had any effect on the quasi-war with France, but an election was coming up 2 years later, the election of 1800. The Jeffersonian Party was rising, and the Adams administration was trying to crush out political opposition. Somewhere between 10 and 15 newspaper editors actually were put on trial under the Sedition Act, and some of them were thrown in jail. The most famous was Matthew Lyon, a member of Congress from Vermont, who also edited a newspaper very strongly anti-Adams, and he was actually convicted under the Sedition Act and jailed for a while. But the reaction against this was very strong and actually contributed to the election of Jefferson in 1800, when the slogan of the Jeffersonians was Jefferson and Liberty. And one of the things they meant by liberty was rescinding the Alien and Sedition Acts, which they did soon after getting into office.
Okay, so students, you need to pay attention here to what the historian Eric Foner is sharing with regards to Alien and Sedition. It was related to political turmoil. It was also related to the fact that there was this fear. Political refugees were arriving in the United States en masse. Many in the U.S. feared their ideas would destabilize the U.S. democracy. And this concern about immigrants translated into a political tone, because at that time, the Federalists were being challenged. The Federalists, when the United States was first created, everybody thought it was just going to be one party, and that was the Federalist Party. But the Federalist Party was breaking apart under John Adams' administration. Actually, Thomas Jefferson led a separate movement and created the Democratic Republican Party to challenge the Federalists. So John Adams is reacting to Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson is using the immigrants because they're coming in and they're supporting the Democratic Republicans. So John Adams passes these laws to stop Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republican Party. So again, what's most importantly is that it was bitter partisan conflict between the Federalist Party of John Adams and the Democratic Republican Party of Thomas Jefferson, but it was also during a time of fear and reaction. And that fear and reaction led to the notion of using the term alien. And this is so significant because we need to understand why alien is still part of our vocabulary that we use to describe immigrants. It's always associated with sedition. And I want to introduce this to you because the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, though they're not on the books anymore, in World War I, during World War I, these acts are going to come back, and they're going to be known as the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1917 and the Espionage Act of 1918. Anyway, when we get to it, we'll appreciate the specific years. Now, let's take a look at a film clip from a movie portraying John Adams. And let's encounter the political division amongst the slaveholding classes under Thomas Jefferson, the slavery classes, and capitalism, John Adams and the indentured servant. Because that's basically what we see. We see two wealthy white males, privileged white males, and they are each representing different kinds of labor forces. John Adams represented the indentured, is the one that the white males, rich white males benefit from having indentured servants, whereas Thomas Jefferson is benefiting from having African slaves. Let's take a look at these two presidents hammer it out over the Alien Sedition Acts.
When will we escape this dreadful city, Doctor?
Philadelphia is not to your liking, sir.
Well, I'd rather be in my own country. Would not you?
I would, Mr. Jefferson, yes.
Well, excuse me.
You're about to take a leap in the dark, Mr. Jefferson.
I would gladly lend my hand to sink the whole island of Great Britain in the ocean.
have not heard you say 3 words together in the last Congress. With such passion, I regret that you have not made your mind more plainly known.
Okay, the crew just got a little bit mixed up here those were very valuable discourses, but the main discourse that I wanted you to hear was when they're talking about the Alien and Sedition Act, which is at the 3:15 mark and goes, just stop at the 4:40. So maybe we're already queued up and we can go back to that film clip so we can understand the Alien and Sedition Acts and that debate.
By these measures, some within your party hope to silence the opposition. I assure you they will give it body and solidarity.
Well, I am a party of one, Thomas, as you well know.
Why blacken your fragile reputation by an assault on the freedoms for which we both fought? Do you intend to ship out the entire French population of the United States? Along with any other luckless soul who happens to voice a contrary opinion?
Well, if that contrary opinion threatens to divide the nation at a time when we must stand united, then yes, I will do just that. I'm entrusted with the nation's safety, Thomas. So these war measures will protect us from insurrection and subversion.
There is no war.
And that is the principle behind these measures. The prevention of war.
Cannot protect the nation by attacking the right of every man to speak freely without fear. You're trampling on the Constitution.
I think President Trump needs to watch this particular film. But nonetheless, the film helps us appreciate the dialogue over immigration policy during the era. Stephen Delane plays Thomas Jefferson, and Paul Giamatti does a wonderful job portraying John Adams. Immigrants fleeing revolution in Europe had the potential of creating conduct or speaking language inciting rebellion against the authority of the state. John Adams' Federalist Party used this act to incarcerate Democratic Republicans and journalists who challenged Federalist policy. It was passed to control a perceived threat to U.S. national security. And Thomas Jefferson, what he's going to do is resign from his position in John Adams as his vice president, and he's going to escape to Montebello and eventually come back and challenge him in the election of 1800. And when Thomas Jefferson comes back to power in 1800, his administration will abolish the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. But what is important to note about this experience is that white European immigrants are always considered by politicians as potential sources of support. This is very important with regards to understanding and appreciating the race hatred that we have today. Whites are being told that they're wanted, okay? So let's appreciate the early administration's treatment of citizenship or naturalization laws. And let's talk about the naturalization laws that are going to be passed by the early administration. Among the few powers that are explicitly reserved in the Constitution for the federal government is that of naturalization. The national government, not state governments, retains control of naturalization. It is the federal government. The constitutional mandate of Article 1, Section 8 vests naturalization powers with the national government. Now, had nationalization powers rested with the states, states not wishing to receive immigrants could have developed restrictive naturalization rules. Now, the first Congress developed an outline for naturalization requirements that has survived for the past 240 years, or 220 years, however long this nation has been. With a brief 4-year exception to the rule in the early history of the nation, most immigrants have been assured of a relatively quick transition to citizenship. Now, despite periodic local passions against immigrants, the United States has consistently provided immigrants a path to citizenship. This is what makes this country so amazing, is that everyone in the world or every nation in the world has people here in the United States as part of its citizen. Policymakers have addressed who should be offered citizenship and who should administer their transition from immigration to citizen. So U.S. naturalization laws has examined the question of who should be offered U.S. citizenship, and they do it in two ways. The first involves the categories of immigrants to be offered citizenship. Who should be allowed citizenship? And then the other way, the second, concerns the characteristics and the abilities that individuals within these categories need to have to be eligible for naturalization. So, throughout the 19th century, Congress's primary concern was who should be allowed citizenship. And beginning at the turn of the 20th century, the debates focused on the characteristics and abilities that individuals possessed. Now, in one of its first acts, the first Congress established the framework for U.S. naturalization. The laws address both the question of categories and individual qualifications. So, if you could put back up on the bottom third, the naturalization laws. Now, in 1790, and I want to share with you 1790, 1795, 1798, and 1802. 1802 is very important because that law is still with us. But it starts with 1790. It extended the privilege of naturalization to all quote-unquote free white persons. Okay? So remember, this nation was created for free white persons. Please understand that. Trump is constantly addressing that issue. All right? There were residency and character requirements of those free white persons. Now, among the white immigrants, individuals had to have resided in the U.S. for 2 years. That was in 1790. And in the state that they're applying for citizenship, they had to reside in that state for 1 year. Applicants were to be of good character, and they had to take an oath to support the Constitution. Children became citizens through their parents' application. And then the privilege of applying for citizenship was limited to only men. And again, remember, we got race, class, and gender all tied into the foundation of the United States, especially with regards to immigration and naturalization. Women could only gain citizenship through their husbands. Now, the First Amendment to the law came just 5 years later in 1795. And I'd like for you to keep that up, so I'll be addressing that. In 1795, Congress extended the minimum period of U.S. residence to 5 years and added 2 requirements. In addition to swearing allegiance to the Constitution, new applicants had to renounce their former allegiance by name. So, for example, if you're an immigrant from England, you had to, and you're coming into the United States and you want to be a citizen of the United States, you had to renounce your allegiance to the King of England. And immigrants also had to renounce hereditary titles to nobility. So if you were a prince, if you were a sir, you had to renounce your title. And this is a requirement that remains today as a question on the naturalization application. You cannot have your title. Now, in response to the anti-immigrant fervor of the Alien and Sedition Acts, again, with regards to fear, now we come to the 1798 law. Congress amended the law in 1798 in response to the immigrant fear by extending the period of residency from 5 to 14 years. Now, as part of its effort to limit access to U.S. citizenship, Congress excluded from eligibility citizens of countries with which the U.S. was at war. And by 1802, once Thomas Jefferson is back in power and challenges John Adams for the presidency, national concern about loyalty declined, and under the Jefferson administration, the naturalization requirements of 1795 were reestablished. So the requirement of 5 years of residence prior to naturalization, enacted in 1802, that has not been changed. It is still part of the process today. Okay? Now, let's take a look at who's going to administer the award of citizenship. But before I do that, there's a question by a student. Samantha, thank you very much for your participation in this class. Samantha, you are asking me an opinion. In your opinion, do you believe that Mexicans, African Americans, Asians, and Native Americans are still at a disadvantage because we still are following white master? Samantha, you remember my racialization process, okay? You know, there are always the canned green beans, and the green beans just have a problem with regards to being accepted, okay? So Samantha, take a look at the racialization process and what I shared with you, that racism is an instrument of power used by those in power to perpetuate their power. And under this administration, we have one of the most racist administrations ever come to power, and just blatantly. So, Samantha, think about the questions that you asked and recognize and reframe it and shape it so that we understand what's going to be happening. So please understand the historical experience, the foundation of this country, and understand why each generation has to challenge and resist, because remember, it's the laws that keep people in a disadvantaged position. So you have to have a population that resists that process to make sure that the government is out of the business of discriminating and segregating. So yes, that's one of the things that's most important to appreciate. Thank you, Samantha, for participating, and continue, please. Now, who's going to administrate the award of citizenship? In the 19th century, U.S. naturalization policy was characterized by local administration. States and localities implemented the minimal federal standards, and states and localities decided who's going to join the nation, the polity. So while the federal laws are concerned with the question of what types of people are eligible, local governments evaluated whether applicants met the minimum federal standards. So since there were no reporting requirements, scholars have no idea of how many immigrants earned U.S. citizenship through naturalization prior to 1907, when the federal government will take over that. Local governments provided documentation to demonstrate the immigrant was a U.S. citizen, but without federal regulation, local governments could use their power to limit or facilitate access to citizenship or access to naturalization. Many state and local governments in the 19th and early 20th centuries saw immigrants as a rich pool for populating territory that was taken from native peoples. Other states followed nativist impulses for using local discretion to exclude from successful naturalization some immigrants who were eligible. And that's each state history and their history with racism. Despite the potential for local abuse and exclusion, the use of local discretion facilitated naturalization. So the failure to assure standardized administration of citizenship reflects a problem in the delivery of many governmental services. Now, the legacy of local administration remains today, as we can see in the heated climate in Arizona that we just witnessed with regards to Sheriff Joe Arpaio and the banning of Chicano studies. So, while the steady flow of immigrants characterized the early 19th century, a torrent of people are going to arrive between 1840 to 1860. And this is related to the United States expanding westward, because between 1840 and 1860, the United States is going to double its size because it's going to take over half of Mexico and it's going to take over California. So between 1840 to 1860, historians are going to identify this immigration as the first great wave. And as Gonzalez shares with you, whereas annual immigration levels had numbered approximately 14,000 in the 1820s, 16,000 in the 1830s, or 60,000, the pace is going to quicken to 171,000 yearly in the 1840s, and it's going to rise to 260,000 in the 1850s. So we're talking about a lot of immigrants coming into the United States. The surge in population came from the new national origins of the majority of the immigrants. Before this era, most immigrants and natives were Protestants. The majority in the first great wave are going to be Irish immigrants of the Roman Catholic faith and German immigrants of Jewish background. So we're going to have Irish Catholics and German Jews. So Irish Catholics and German Jews, with regards to Protestants, this just doesn't fit. You understand? Hopefully you'll recognize why there was Charlottesville. Now, cultural conflict is going to arise and economic competition is going to ensue. Now, as is frequently the case with immigrants, the Germans, the Irish, and the others who arrived in the 1840s and 1850s, they are going to come into primarily the northeastern cities, Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. They're not going to spread themselves evenly across the country at first. Germans and Irish are going to concentrate in the major cities. Why? Because the major cities that are expanding in terms of markets are the ones that are recruiting them. The growth of the cities and the increasing volume of immigrants created a new dynamic in the history of immigration. Cities came to overlap with immigrant ethnic populations. And so as industrialization, which was unregulated at that time, as it continued apace, the quote-unquote problems of the cities were often veiled in ethnic references to immigrants. Immigrants and their descendants are the problems of why we have, or the problems that we have in the cities. So because the immigrants, because of their language, because of their religion, immigrants in the first great wave are going to challenge the dominant culture of the United States, which is primarily British and Northern and Western European. For the most part, they were, the first great wave, they were unskilled, they were coming from rural communities. So the needs of the U.S. economy requires laborers. They require workers, especially as industry continues. So you need people who are willing to work. So the level to which they succeeded economically varied with the cycles of boom and bust in capitalism. And up until 1840, the states and the territories the United States acquired are always looking for workers. The majority of the U.S.-born populations lived in rural areas. So immigrants who stayed in the cities didn't challenge the economic well-being of the majority of the U.S.-born. But as capitalism encouraged a faster pace of market development and industrialization, American values that were rooted in an agrarian lifestyle, in the farming lifestyle, in what was known as the yeoman ideal, that was being demolished, especially in the Northeast. Poverty, crime, and illiteracy were becoming the norm in the rising market centers and cities of the East, not the tranquil countryside where there were the farms and Old MacDonald had a farm, E-I-E-I-O. What was happening in the cities was poverty, crime, and illiteracy. So these experiences contrasted starkly with the notion of Old MacDonald and his farm. The traditions that were rooted in a rural experience, well, in the Northeast, they're being replaced by new exchange values of capitalism introduced by this rapidly expanding market economy. So, what happened, in contrast to the rural serendipity, the other side of progress revealed much human misery. The problems that progress created, the problems introduced by the rise of urban centers, by the rise of industry, led many people to question their surroundings. With more and more crowding came anonymity. And to be anonymous means to be nobody, a loser, nothing. So because of poor urban planning, no attention was paid to sanitation, which made the potential for epidemic disease frightening. And with industrialization came cheap labor. And recent immigrants, largely German Jews and Irish Catholics, encountered problems of acculturation. So as progress expanded, so did immigration. Now the older generations, the children of immigrants themselves from a previous era, began to question, especially in the Northeast, this new wave of immigrants that came in, and they started to question their linguistic, cultural, and religious affiliations. The newcomers they're coming in between 1840 to 1860 are speaking a different language. The newcomers are dressed in curious clothing. The newcomers pray in an unlike fashion. So immigrants were dissimilar, and they became associated with the problems of the other side of progress. And so, immigrants to the U.S.-born populations are ruining the fiber and the backbone of the system. Immigrants are going to be blamed for urban crime. Immigrants are going to be blamed for alcohol abuses. They're going to be blamed for political corruption. They're going to be blamed for undercutting of wages. This part of the American character is identified as nativism. So Samantha, pay attention. Nativism. This nativism begins in this era, the 1840s. Let's put that up on the bottom thirds. Nativism. It enters in the 1840s. It is not the 20th century. Everyone who claims to be an American since that time, since the 1840s, and up until today, the 21st century, develops this disease, this nativism. You develop it, it's some aspect of the nativist character is in you if you claim to be an American. Because as an American, you have learned the prejudices of everything, and especially with regards to immigration, you've learned that term alien, and it's always associated with sedition. And so let's talk about nativism. Let me repeat this again. Everyone who claims to be an American, even you students, you who claim to be an American, since the 1840s and up until today, you've developed nativism. Americans have developed this. Is very, very important. You have some aspect of this nativist character in you. It's just something that's learned. It's something that's part of the educational system. It's something that's part of the history of the United States. I don't care what kind of bean you are, whether you're a white bean or a black bean or red bean, yellow bean, whatever. All these beans have developed the prejudice, have accepted the prejudices of the dominant capitalist class. Okay? Again, I don't like canned green beans, but nonetheless, all of these beans, no matter what your race, no matter what your color, no matter what your creed, no matter what your gender, if you call yourself an American, I know you have nativist tendencies. If it is in your blood to be prejudiced against the immigrant population, especially the recent immigrant, that's the American way. Nativism in America is like diarrhea being inherited. It runs in your genes. You see, Americans always want to blame somebody for their problems because Americans have a lot of problems. And so Americans think that they are Egyptians because they live on Denial River. So in the 1850s, anti-immigrant mobilization appeared in the guise of a political party. The American or Know Nothing Party, their agenda was a concern about immigrants, particularly about the cultural differences, particularly about the political differences. And what they did was they called themselves the Know Nothings. I know nothing. And perceived they did not like the immigrants coming in. Now, one of their demands was for an extension of the period prior to naturalization from 5 years to 21 years. And we can see this nativist character in the debates over what to do with immigrants today. The party in the American Party, or the Know Nothing Party, reached its peak in the 1856 election. All right? But what happened was, back then, it never influenced national immigration policy. So you can see the whole notion of here are these immigrants. They speak a different language. They have a different religion. They have different cultural aspects. But it only happened in the Northeast, in the cities, where the immigrants are being used to work in the factory system of production. Capitalist American immigration policy is bringing them in by the thousands. And so Americans who are here, they're looking at them and they're going, what are you doing here? You're taking our jobs. You're doing what are the arguments? Well, those arguments were formulated in the 1840s. And so The American or Know Nothing Party reached its peak in 1856, but it never influenced national immigration policy. Why? Because its decline came at the onset of the Civil War. Because the Civil War is going to reshape U.S. politics. It's going to reshape the party system. See, concern over immigration policy in the 1850s was lost in a larger controversy over what to do with the involuntary immigrant. You see, these are the voluntary immigrants. They're not liking the voluntary immigrants. But what about the involuntary immigrant, the slave? Let's appreciate the nature of the immigrant struggle against nativism by watching a film clip from a movie that sensationally captures the hate towards the other that Americans are professional at. Let's go into that film clip, The Gangs of New York.
Is this it, priest? The Pope's new army? A few crusty bitches and a handful of ragtags?
I know, Bill. You swore this was a battle between warriors, not a bunch of Miss Nancys. So warriors is what I brought.
The O'Connell Guard! The Plumduggies! The Shirt Tails! The Chichesters! The 40 Thieves!
Bene. On my challenge, by the ancient laws of combat, we are met at this chosen ground to settle for good and all who holds sway over the 5 points. Us natives, born rightwise to this fine land, or the foreign hordes defiling it.
The ancient laws of combat, I accept the challenge of the so-called natives. You plague our people at every turn. But from this day out, you shall plague us no more. For let it be known that the hand that tries to string us from this land shall be swiftly cut down.
May the Christian Lord guide my hand against your Roman popery.
Prepare to receive the true Lord.
Okay, nativism, classic Hollywood style. Again, it's about being human, you know, the green beans. black, white, yellow, red, brown, human. That's what it's all about. Now, one of the things that's most important is that while this debate was going on over what to do with the immigrants, there's a larger debate, and that's going to be known as the Civil War. What do you do with black people? What do you do with the black beans? What are the black beans? Black beans. Black beans. America has problems with the black beans. That's what the Civil War was all about. And the Civil War, as a result of the Civil War, we get 3 amendments to the Constitution, which are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. But what concerns us here is what the first civil rights movement, people call the first civil rights, I call it the second. The first is the abolitionist movement. But the civil rights movement, known as the Civil War, and brought us what is known as Reconstruction and the Reconstruction Acts, which are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. The 14th Amendment, of course, it took African slaves to help determine citizenship, because Africans were denied citizenship, African slaves. So now we're going to understand the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, because this amendment to the Constitution is so important, so crucial today. The 14th Amendment is the 1868 Naturalization Law. The 14th Amendment is the first time that naturalization extended beyond the 1790 standard of free white persons. So the 14th Amendment, that's the amendment to the Constitution that corporations have used to protect their civil rights. But this 14th Amendment was used to protect the civil rights of African Americans, of Black Lives Matter. The award of birthright citizenship is important to understand. All right? The 14th Amendment is one of the post-Civil War amendments. It was intended to secure rights for former slaves. And it includes, most importantly, the due process and the Equal Protection Clause, amongst others. So the amendment provides a broad definition of U.S. citizenship. And as we will learn when I talk about the black beans, it supersedes the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Dred Scott versus Stanford that had excluded slaves imported from Africa and their descendants. So the amendment requires states to provide equal protection under the law to all persons within their jurisdiction and to grant citizenship to those who are born in the United States. This due process clause has been the basis of much important and controversial issues regarding privacy rights, abortion, and other issues, especially today, birthright issues with regards to immigrants and their children. Now, after the Civil War, the United States is, between 1870 to 1920, is going to take over capitalism, and Wall Street is going to take over this country, and it's going to organize the greatest march of economic growth in human history, and it's going to need workers. So between 1870 to 1920, more than 26 million people are going to come to the United States between 1870 to 1920. Historians refer to the arrival of these populations as the Second Great Wave. All of us are familiar with this part of immigration history because the experience popularized the Statue of Liberty, and Ellis Island became the immigration processing station in this era. Now, there's 3 reasons for remembering the Second Wave's significance. First, these immigrants settled throughout the nation. They came from Asia, they came from the Americas, but most importantly, they came from Africa, but most importantly, they came from Europe. And third, the federal government is going to assert its control over immigration policy in this era. Immigrants in this period alone exceeded the national populations that was established in 1850. So the immigrants are going to outnumber the population of the United States that was established in 1850. It's very, very important. The symbolism of this period is still alive with us today. Ellis Island came into use as an immigration processing station. Let's go to a film clip from a documentary on the Southern and Eastern Europeans who formed part of this wave. We got the film clip on Ellis Island.
Over 12 million men, women, and children passed this way. Passed through rooms and corridors haunted with a special stillness which remains only in places once noisy with human life. Here they bought tickets for 1,000 places in America. Here they traded their drachmas, their liras, and their rubles for dollars. Here they sang their first American songs, experienced their first American Christmas and Hanukkah. Here they waited to be given permission to pass over to the new land. Tens of millions of us have relatives who came this way. Sat in this room, part of the largest human migration in history. Of the many who came, some were turned away. But even they would leave part of themselves in America to remind us why they had come so far. Why they had made the journey.
Okay, later on when I talk about the white beans, we will appreciate something about the Second Great Wave, because the Second Great Wave is very significant for us to understand about formation and control of labor forces. But what is important is that Ellis Island is remembered as the great processing center, but what happened at this time between 1870 and 1920 is that it's also a period of increasing restriction. And this wave of immigration ended with one of the most draconian restrictions that the United States ever imposed, and that is the 1924 Immigration Quota Restriction or Quota Act, which ends this presentation. Now, the Second Great Wave was a period of vast immigration, but it was also a time of increasing selection in who could immigrate and in what numbers. So let me address another question by a student. Samantha, thank you for asking the question. Vivian, you have a question. Vivian, I'm going to address your question at the end of the class, but I'm going to go to Samantha right now. Samantha, you say that English settlers settled here with this entitlement, and that's what created nativism. So nativism is just feeling entitled that Americans earned this land. They are entitled to call themselves the natives of this land. In one sense, yes. In another sense, no, Samantha. It's not just English settlers. What happened in the War of 1812 was that it solidified for the first time that the United States would remain the United States, because Great Britain had attempted to take over the United States and in fact went into Washington, D.C. and burned it down in the War of 1812. So it was the War of 1812 that the United States finally solidified itself as a nation. So all of those people who had fought in that war, that's where you have the national anthem. The national anthem wasn't, about Jose, can you see? The national anthem comes from the War of 1812, not the Revolutionary War. So it is in this period that people began to get a sense of identity as being American. And yes, it was for whites. It was for whites only. So when you have, by 1840, this nation and the immigrants coming in massive numbers, then those whites who are already here don't like the whites that are coming in, because the whites that are coming in are Irish, or they're German, they're Catholic, or they're Jews. And so Catholics and Jews don't sit very well with Protestants, okay? So the nativist character of, well, what's an American? Yes, that's the entitlement. So the immigrant character comes in, and you have that, you begin to associate these people as quote unquote aliens, okay? So these alien peoples. and it develops a prejudice that eventually, if you can turn that prejudice into discrimination, then you put them in a disadvantaged position. So that's the whole idea in terms of the debate with regards to racism, okay? So thank you very much for asking that question, Samantha. Now, in 1875, Congress placed the first restriction on immigration by individuals other than Africans destined for slavery. California white labor forces organized to restrict the economic power of Chinese immigrants. Chinese contract laborers became the target. So while Europeans are coming in on the east part, Chinese are coming in the west, okay? So the law reflected the nativist impulses of the popular American culture. Let's go to a film clip about how newspapers around the country, and especially in California, started to discredit and blame the Chinese for most things, especially white unemployment. The police also discriminated against the Chinese by using the slightest opportunity to arrest them. Let's take a look at a documentary featuring the nativist reaction against Asians.
As the job market tightened, resentment and violence against Chinese laborers increased, the most prevalent sign of a growing nativist movement aimed at all immigrants. In 1882, just 1 year after Qianlong's arrival in California, the United States passed legislation banning most Chinese immigration.
The Chinese Exclusion Act excluded Chinese laborers from entering the United States, exempted diplomats, students, and merchants. It also denied all Chinese, regardless of what their class status was, the right to become an American citizen. And I think it was passed because of the rise in nativism during that time period. Obviously, there's a certain class fear about Chinese laborers coming into the country, and that's why they're specifically targeted for exclusion. But I think it receives national support, and it receives support from all the various classes because all Chinese are viewed as somehow un-American, that they bring over not just the possibility of lowering the wage scale, but also these dangerous habits associated with heathenism. It really sets the precedent for a series of Asian exclusion laws and really immigration exclusion laws as a whole.
Immigrant and minority groups, they're always the first to be victimized in times of societal stress. When there are economic problems, they're blamed for bringing on the economic problems. When there are crimes, they're blamed for being the criminals, even when there's no evidence. People assume the other.
The Exclusion Act would finally be repealed in 1943. But until then, facing loneliness, discrimination, and the threat of violence, many Asian immigrants chose to return home. But many more stayed in San Francisco and built a strong cross-cultural society that would have a deep and lasting impact on American life.
Okay, so we now appreciate something about the yellow beans and how there's going to be a restriction on them. Now, in the period after the Civil War, immigrants experienced a new incentive to develop an attachment to the United States. So the cities to which most immigrants, at least initially, came into were under the control of what were known as urban political machines. And in most cities, these machines were themselves controlled by first and second generation immigrants. In other words, they were controlled by children of people who had immigrated to the United States after the Civil War. So these machines served several important roles for immigrants. They provided for them a crude social welfare system, jobs, food, and emergency needs in times of crisis. So machines were crucial to immigrant survival. Let's go to a film clip and appreciate their importance.
The surge of immigrants and the rise of ethnic neighborhoods also shaped the politics of the city. Political machines courted these new voters from the moment they landed.
Political bosses are very important in the life of the immigrants. They sometimes help them find a place to live. They help the widow if the husband dies. They help the husband get a job. They help fix tickets if you get a ticket for having a push cart outside. And they only ask for one thing in return. At election time, they go to all these immigrants who they have helped, and they say, "My friend is running for office. Would you please vote for my friend?" You'd have to be an ingrate not to vote for the friend. So the political bosses gained power because they had a lot of votes.
Okay, so these machines served a very important role for immigrants, assistance with naturalization and socialization to voting. So it was these immigrants' votes that allowed the machines to remain in power in the late 19th and early 20th century. That despite the machines, life for many of the immigrants was quite dismal. Housing conditions were poor, workplaces were dangerous, crime and disease rife. Women and children worked in factories with no protections. Let's go with a film clip celebrating a photojournalist named Jacob Riis, who through his famous work entitled How the Other Half Lives, ensured that Americans would see the conditions that immigrants faced.
In October 1890, a curious volume went on sale in the bookstores of New York. Called How the Other Half Lives, it had been written by a 41-year-old Danish-born police reporter named Jacob Riis. It would change forever the way people thought about the city. Riis had come to New York in 1870, when he was just 21, with $40 in his pocket. The money soon ran out, and he had learned firsthand what immigrant life could be like in the sprawling metropolis. Homeless, often hungry, and out of work, he had drifted into the crime-infested world of the 5 Points slum, dozing on the cold, filthy floors of police lodging houses. More than once, he considered killing himself. Eventually, he landed on his feet and managed to find work as a police reporter for the New York Tribune, and spent the next 10 years exploring the densely crowded slums of the Lower East Side. The sights, he later said, gripped my heart until I felt that I must tell of them or burst. Determined to show the world what he had seen, Riis began publishing magazine articles, but they seemed to make no impression, he wrote. He thought of taking pictures, but the tenements were too dark for the photographs to come out. Then, in 1887, a breakthrough came with the invention of a new photographic device, a magnesium flash powder that flooded even the deepest shadow with a brilliant flash of light. Armed with the new apparatus, Riis and his assistants plunged into the 5 Points.
With their way illuminated by spasmodic flashes, as bright and brief as those of lightning itself, a mysterious party has lately been startling the town. Denizens of the dives, tramps and bummers in their lodgings, have marveled at the phenomenon. What they saw was 3 or 4 figures in the gloom, a ghostly tripod, some weird and uncanny movements, a blinding flash, and then the patter of retreating footsteps, and the mysterious visitors were gone. The New York Sun, February 12, 1888.
They would go into places, especially at night, with the brand new flash powder attachment and surprise people. Sleepers in these kind of collective sleeping rooms, or drinkers in these rot gut saloons.
The images Riis brought back brought wealthy and middle-class New Yorkers face to face with a reality most had long sought to avoid. Their city, one of the wealthiest in the world, had become home to more than 1 million overworked and undernourished people, often living in conditions of unspeakable horror. He went everywhere, carrying his camera down obscure courtyards and back ways, with names like Ragpicker's Row, Blind Man's Alley, and Bottled Alley. In a place called Bandit's Roost, he photographed 12 men, all said to be wanted for murder. He was especially moved by the plight of the young, the ragged street Arabs who sold newspapers by day and slept in alleys by night. The child laborers who often worked 7 days a week in stifling factories and sweatshops. And the tens of thousands of abandoned and orphaned children who had been left to fend for themselves. But what horrified him most was the unspeakable conditions in which so many New Yorkers were forced to live.
you have a vast influx of new immigrant groups. So that whereas in 1860 it was essentially a city of small homes, by 1900 the most crowded neighborhoods in the world were in New York City, especially on the Lower East Side, but also in East Harlem. You have the rise of tenement housing, which is really worse than anything that was ever seen in the United States. And it's probably about as bad as anything that's ever been put up anywhere in the world.
A tenement, briefly defined, is simply a building that concentrates as many people into as little space as possible, with the lowest overhead costs for the landlord. The tenements began sometime in the middle of the 19th century, and there were no laws governing the tenement, so it really stuffed people into 6 or 7 floors of rickety walk-up, jammed into as many rooms as possible, many of which were interior rooms with no light of any sort or air.
I went up the dark stairs in one of those tenements, and there I trod upon a baby. It is the regular means of introduction in the old dark houses, but I was never able to get used to it. I photographed the baby, standing with its back against the public sink, in a pool of filth that overflowed on the floor. I do not marvel that 1 in 5 children in the rear tenement, into which the sunlight never comes, was killed by the house. It seems strange, rather, that any survived. Jacob Riis.
Many of the tenements were...
All right, so let's put up on the bottom thirds, nativism influences policy. Very important. Nativism influences policy. Please appreciate this throughout this course. Again, the bottom thirds, nativism influences policy. Because after passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, Congress increasingly began to take centralized control of immigration by establishing standards for state boards of immigration. So if you could put nativism influences policy. And we'll take a look at the restrictions because it's going to lead up to the Quota Act. Restrictions began to increase as new classes of people are going to be added to the list of those to be excluded. Started with the Chinese. Then people likely to become public charges were created in 1882. By 1885, all contract labor from Asia. Anarchists in 1903. Imbeciles, mental defects, unaccompanied children, and immoral women in 1907. And illiterate, and finally, all Asians in 1917. And then finally, during World War I, the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1918. Now, these peaceful efforts at immigration control shared a theme, excluding the less desirable quote-unquote aliens from residence in the United States. However, enforcement rested with local authorities who didn't share the legislative concern about immigration. So in 1907, Congress created a commission to develop a comprehensive immigration policy in 1907. And after 15 years, and in the early 1920s, Congress finally crafted legislation that created a closed-door policy. The open borders of the United States would now be protected, and it was known as the Quota Acts of 1921 and 1924. So, crew, if you could put the Quota Acts of 1921 and 1924, and these Quota Acts established a virtual barricade against the national origins populations that had increasingly dominated the immigration flow in the early years of the 20th century. The Quota Acts established a national annual limit on immigration and allocated visas within the national limit based on the presence of foreign-born persons by country as measured in the 1910 census in the 1924 bill and the 1890 census in the 1921 bill. We will come to explore how these acts impacted the American populace in future sessions. So, get to know it, class. This is, I just wanted to introduce you to the gamut of laws, because I'm not going to address these laws in future presentations. In future presentations, I'm going to start now in 2 weeks. We'll start with the red beans, and then we'll move to the white beans, and then we'll move to the black beans, and then we'll move to the yellow beans, and then we'll move to the get down, get brown beans. But ultimately, we all have to recognize that we're all human beings, okay? So whether it is black, white, red, yellow, brown, we're all human, okay? And that's understanding certain things with regards to immigration. So I want to, again, thank you for your participation in the class. And what I want to do is I want to end with one last question. And Vivian, thank you very much. I reserved your last question for concluding this class. As a child, I was taught in school that Christopher Columbus came to America, made friends with the Indians, and that's why we celebrate Thanksgiving today. It wasn't until college that anyone started teaching the truth, that Cristobal Colon, who was looking for the country of India, was hopelessly lost, came upon the land, what is now called America. Yes, isn't that amazing? We do have that misnomer today because we still think that native peoples are Indians, and they're not, because a lot of times people mistake me for an Indian person, and when they ask me if I'm Indian, I tell them I am not officially recognized as an Indian person. Anyway, what followed this arrival was one of the largest genocides of millions of indigenous people with the goal to take their lands, knowledge, and tools in order to obtain wealth. Since then, the government has repeatedly made laws and policies to make it possible to continue to do whatever they want in order to create wealth and power, regardless of who they hurt and whose labor built America. Well, Vivian, welcome to capitalism. Capitalism is about making money on the market, regardless of your morals or your values or your ethics. Just take a look at the president, and what he's using his office for is to make sure that Ivanka makes money. Do you believe that we perpetuate the same behaviors that have occurred for the last several hundred years by not educating people with the truth from childhood? And if the truth was taught, how do you think this would change how people like Trump and his supporters view immigrants? Why do you think that these same inaccuracies continue to be taught when so many people have been taught the truth? Well, now, Vivian, that is so controversial. That's why we're in this class. That's why we want to learn more about the experience. Welcome, Vivian, to the controversies. We are going to appreciate everything that you're sharing because if you did have a learned population, perhaps capitalism, we wouldn't be living under capitalism. Thank you very much. We'll see you 2 weeks from now.